Hey everybody, welcome back to my Chanel. Today we need to talk about something serious, something that could have huge implications for the future of American democracy. Right now we're witnessing a situation that has the potential to become a constitutional crisis, one of the biggest tests for the rule of law in modern US history. Now, if you're not super into politics, don't worry, I'm going to be breaking this down so it actually makes sense. So let's get into it. So right now, Donald Trump is facing a Supreme Court ruling that requires him to release nearly $2 billion in foreign aid that Congress has already approved. If he continues to ignore the courts and refuses to comply, this could be one of those moments that we look back and say, yeah, this was the turning point. But to really understand why this matters, we need to look back at history, because this kind of crisis, we've been there before. So what is a constitutional crisis? A constitutional crisis happens when the government literally doesn't know how to handle a situation because the normal rules aren't being followed. It usually happens in one of four ways. One, a president ignores the Supreme Court. That's what we're worried about right now. If Trump refuses to comply, it raises the question, what happens when a president just says no to the law? Number two, the Constitution doesn't have a clear answer. So sometimes we hit a situation that the founders just didn't account for, and we have to create laws in the abstract for. Number three, branches of government are at war. So when the courts, Congress, and the presidency refuses to acknowledge each other's authority, we get chaos. And then number four, there's no way to enforce the law. If the system breaks down and there's no real consequence, then what's to stop others from doing the same? Now, this situation with USAID falls into the first category. Donald Trump is in a position where he could defy the courts. And if history teaches us anything, it's that when a president challenges the system and gets away with it, it only gets worse. Now, this isn't even the first time that Donald Trump has challenged legal authority. He actually has a long history of ignoring laws, court rulings, and different constitutional norms. For example, he was impeached twice, the first time for abusing his power to pressure Ukraine into investigating his political opponent, and the second time for inciting an insurrection on January 6th. He defied congressional subpoenas during both impeachment trials. Trump's administration refused to hand over key documents and blocked court officials from testifying. He violated court rulings on immigration. Court struck down his attempts to end DACA, but his administration still slow-walked the process. He ignored the Hatch Act. The administration repeatedly used government resources for political gains, even though that's hella illegal. And so, looking back at right now, the idea that Trump might ignore the Supreme Court is not a stretch. It's something that he's already done in the past. And if he does it again right now, the stakes are even higher. Now, this isn't even the first time we've seen a president push the limits of their power. We can go back to Watergate and Nixon in the 1970s. Richard Nixon got caught up in Watergate, which was essentially a massive abuse of power and illegal spying on political opponents. The courts and Congress told him to hand over tapes that proved he was guilty, and Richard Nixon refused until it became clear that he would be impeached and removed from office. Ultimately, he ended up resigning. That's an example of the system working because Nixon backed down. There was the respect for that rule of law. You know what I'm saying? Another example I'm thinking about is the 1860s. Before the Civil War, there was a huge dispute over slavery and states' rights. Southern states refused to accept the results of the 1860 election and literally left the Union. The government didn't have a clear answer for what happens when states secede, so it escalated into a full-blown war. And obviously, over 600,000 Americans died because the normal political process failed. Now, am I saying we're about to have another civil war? No. But when a president defies the law and refuses to back down, it can lead to dangerous and unpredictable outcomes. And the best example I can think of that relates to what's happening right now is January 6th. On January 6th in 2021, we saw exactly what happens when the people refuse to accept the results of an election. Donald Trump pushed the false claim that the election was stolen, and his supporters literally stormed the Capitol to try to overturn the results. Why was it such a big deal? Because the peaceful transfer of power is literally the backbone of American democracy. And when that's questioned, when people in power refuse to accept legal rulings, things spiral out of control. And that day, violence was the result. Now, with Trump facing a Supreme Court ruling, we're in a similar situation. If a sitting president refuses to acknowledge the court's ruling, what happens next? Does Congress try to step in? What if they fail? Do the courts issue more rulings that he's going to continue to ignore? And if the system doesn't have a way to enforce the law, what stops things from getting worse? So what happens next? There's a couple of different possibilities. One, Congress can get involved. They could issue subpoenas or even impeach Trump if he keeps ignoring the courts. Two, the courts could double down. They could issue more specific orders, which would escalate the legal battle. Three, public unrest grows. If people feel like the government is no longer functioning, protests and even violence could erupt. And so for me, the big question is, will Trump back down, or will this become a full-scale constitutional crisis? I know some people may think, okay, this is just another political fight, so why should I care? But this isn't just about foreign aid. This is about whether or not the U.S. government actually works. If the Supreme Court can be ignored, what stops future presidents from ignoring it too? What happens when a president says, actually, I don't think I need to leave the office after losing an election? If I'm being real, that's why everybody was so shook on January 6th, because it was a glimpse of what happens when the systems break down. And so right now, we are at a crossroads. Either Trump follows the law, or we enter a new era where presidential power goes unchecked. And if history tells us anything, it's that when power goes unchecked, democracy does not last for very long. So that's where we are. Trump has not technically ignored the Supreme Court yet, but given his history of ignoring legal rulings and breaking the law, we've seen this kind of thing before, and it has not really ended well. Nixon had to resign. The Civil War broke out over unresolved tensions. January 6th showed us that people are willing to turn to violence when they feel like the system is against them. So what happens now? That's a question that we all need to be asking, because whether or not you follow politics, this does affect us all. Hope that made sense. Please ask questions in the comments if you need me to go deeper into anything. Do you think this will blow over, or are we headed to a full and real crisis? Stay informed, stay engaged. I want to engage with y'all in the comments, so please feel free to tap in, like, subscribe, and I will talk to y'all next time.